welcome to everyone that's here for their first event at HistFest 2025, and welcome again to all of you that have been here throughout the day. It's just really nice to have you here. This morning when I was doing my intro, I don't know why, I felt like a bit of a rabbit in the headlights. I forgot to give proper housekeeping. I forgot to mention the fire alarm, so I'm going to try and do that properly now. So housekeeping things first of all. If you do hear a fire alarm, there isn't one scheduled to happen. It will be a real one, so please exit the building through the exits, and you'll be guided outside after that point. If you're following online, welcome to you. You can purchase books just like you can here in person, but online you need to do that via the link. And here there's a bookstall outside, so you can purchase books, and there'll be a book signing at the end of the event. And questions. Towards the end of the talk, there'll be an opportunity to put questions to our speakers. If you're here in person, just raise your hand and we'll come round with a roaming mic. If you're watching online, you can submit your questions in the box. I think it's at the bottom of the page. So that's the housekeeping stuff. I also just wanted to flag while everyone's here that and say a thank you to the musicians that we have performing outside, some Tudor musicians who you will have been hearing in between events. So thank you to them. And also Josh, who I will point to, is over there, and he's drawing illustrations based on the talks that are taking place, so do check them out as and when they appear. Okay, right, to the event, the Titanic. I'm going to introduce our speakers one by one, and then just give a little snapshot of why we're here today, the kind of motivating thing behind the event. So first of all, we have Stephen McGann. Hello, Stephen. Stephen is a leading British actor who began his professional career at 19, starring in the West End musical Yakety Yak. He's since worked extensively in British theatre and on screen, and can be seen in Call the Midwife, or maybe it should be called Dr. Turner, in Call the Midwife.
Spin-off for you.
As Dr. Turner. In addition to acting, Stephen is also the author of several non-fiction books, including Dr. Turner's Case Book, which was out in 2016, and a companion to Call the Midwife. And he also is the book of one of my favourite memoirs that I've read. It's really fascinating, and it's on sale outside, which was out in 2017, and it's called Flesh and Blood, A History of My Family in 7 Maladies. Thank you, Duncan.
That's all right.
And we're also joined by Professor Stephanie Barczewski. Stephanie is a specialist in modern British cultural history. She's a professor of history at Clemson University in South Carolina in the States, where she has taught since 1997. In 2005, she became Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies in the College of Architecture, Arts and Humanities at Clemson. She's also the author of numerous books, including Titanic, A Night to Remember, which was released in 2006. 2006. We don't say 2006, do we? We say 2006. So thank you, Duncan. Have you got your own there?
I haven't, no.
Oh.
There are some outside. No, I brought these two because I've been talking them up to people over the past year or so. These are both fantastic books if you're interested in Titanic, or indeed many other historical events that feature in Stephen's book as well.
And on to you, Duncan. We have Duncan here chairing the event. Duncan Barrett is a writer and editor specialising in biography and memoir. He grew up in London and studied English at Jesus College, Cambridge. In 2010, he edited the First World War memoirs of pacifist saboteur Ronald Skirth, which was published as The Reluctant Tommy. He also is co-author with Nuala Calvi of a trio of Sunday Times top 10 bestsellers, including The Sugar Girls, GI Brides, and The Girls Who Went to War. Their latest book, which was literally released a couple of days ago, which Duncan doesn't have a copy of on him sadly. Right now, but it's for sale outside, is called Blitz Kids. The reason that we have this fantastic trio here today is because of a brilliant new podcast series that's been released by Noiser, who are the supporters of this event. It's called The Ship of Dreams, and it's been highly acclaimed in the press and on the One Show as well, referred to as lavish and immersive. So after this event, I'd highly advise having a listen to that. I'm going to give a round of applause to our speakers now, because I've got one more thing to say, but hello. Before we get on to the discussion, we have a short clip from that podcast series that we're going to play now. Thank you.
The explosive force of hitting the iceberg was 1 million foot-tons a second. It was enough to lift the Washington Monument a foot in a second. So, in other words, it was like a bomb going off. People have said that if Murdoch hadn't actually swerved, if you like, to nearly avoid the iceberg, that then there would have been a head-on collision. And it's true that this actually would have saved Titanic, because it would have had the effect, a bit like a car crash, if you like, with crumple zones. It would have the effect of concertinaing in the first 100 feet of the ship. But the rest of the ship would have been completely intact. And in fact, the deceleration at 22 knots in, say, the first 100 feet of crumpling would actually not have even thrown people out of their beds. So it would have been like a motor car of the day gradually coming to a stop.
Professor Stephanie Barczewski, author of Titanic, A Night Remembered.
If Murdoch had made what would have been a terrifying but probably correct decision to say we cannot possibly turn this ship in time, so we're just going to ram into the iceberg head-on. The Titanic was designed to survive that kind of collision. He would have crumpled the bow. He probably would have killed 200 people in the front of the ship, because the impact of something that big, of that ship hitting a big iceberg full on, would have been absolutely devastating. It just would have crushed the front of the ship and killed a lot of people in the process, but the ship would have survived.
So, that's interesting. We hadn't heard that clip. I've heard that clip before.
I hadn't heard it either.
We hadn't heard that clip before. We didn't know that's what was going to be played today. But it's an interesting one, because those people in the front of the ship, many of them were not just any people, but all the engine room crew who were off duty at the time and in their beds resting after their exhausting doesn't begin to cover it, the kind of shifts they would have had, are the people who would have been crushed had they gone straight into the iceberg. Which brings us very nicely to Stephen, to your story, because your great-uncle was one of those guys. He may, in fact, have been in his bed at that time, right?
He could very easily have been in his bed. I don't know where he was for sure. He was either working his backside off in one of the engine rooms, in boiler rooms, or in his bed there. So it's funny. We were chatting about this before, that the twists of fate. When you look at a disaster, with hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, there are so many if-onlys, what-ifs. Oh, imagine who would know the odds if this and that. But occasionally disasters, sometimes terrible disasters, do happen. And even more rarely for someone who studied family history from when he was 17, wanted to know about his dimly known McGann relatives. Dimly because my father's father died when he was only 5 years old. The surprise of finding out that, I knew they were merchant seamen, but to find out the kind of jobs they did in the engine room, known as the Black Gang, and then to find out that one of these was actually on the Titanic and actually survived the Titanic, was something which didn't come to me until much later. And it was unfolded in the most emotional and human way. And it's interesting listening to Stephanie and chatting to Stephanie just before we came in about these human elements of the twists of fate and how they affect real people.
Stephanie, I'll bring you in a minute, but maybe before we sort of go into the kind of bigger picture questions, Stephen, can you just tell us that story of how you found out about Titanic McGann, as he was known? Because it's quite an amazing story. For anyone who's interested in family history, I think you kind of hit the jackpot.
Yeah, if you've got time, I'll keep it as short as possible. But basically, my memoir, which Duncan was mentioning, don't stop leaving with it. but it's a combination of, it's the history of my family over 150 years. Through a lot of the family history research I did and through the diseases they suffered. But anyway, a lot of it's to do with genealogy, which I've always loved. I was 17, I was in Liverpool. Bit of an old a spotty boy who didn't really get the girls or didn't get much attention and liked nerdy things. And I was very happy. I wanted to know. I was the one, I think, in every generation there's one of us who wants to know where we came from. I think that's the genealogist, and I was he. And every good book on genealogy, and I read a few way back when I was 17, it says go and get living testimony. Even if they're old, even if their memories are frail, they might be able to tell you something far richer and more valuable than you will get from a cold record. So on with my pen and paper, literally week one. I'm starting as a genealogist. I go round to see my Auntie Mary, who was my father had died, but she was my father's sister, my auntie. And she lived in a council house in Liverpool. Liverpool council houses, you always get a cup of tea, very large plate of biscuits. Come in, lad, come on, have a sit down. And we had the tea, and so I get the pen and paper out and say, do you know anything about the family, about your family, my father's family? And she told me that, well, my dad and his brother were seamen. They worked in the engine rooms, the ships. I said, oh, that's fascinating. And she's going, walking to, I don't really know very much beyond that, because she was a child when they died. And then as she's sitting there, me with my biscuits, I'm dipping in a biscuit, she said, oh, yeah, Titanic McGann, yeah. Survived the Titanic. I said, what? I mean, this is the equivalent. You know, you go to Somerset for a beach trip, you uncover, like, the grave of Arthur or something. You know, it's ridiculous. You know, and I said, but how? Yeah, he survived the Titanic. Now, her memory was very... Later on, she did have proper dementia, but even before then, her memory was a bit skittish. And so I took this news, went straight down to the local library, looked in the records, and in those days, it wasn't the internet, it was all on microfilm, and I looked, nothing. Absolutely nothing. There was a McCann in the survival list, not a McGann, simple typo. Later on, I was to realise it was, you know, simple misprint. But I go back to Mary the next day. I say, Mary, can you tell me any more about Titanic McGann? She said, who? I said, you know, Titanic McGann had survived the Titanic. And she said, I don't know anything about that. And true, she'd actually forgotten. But I describe it in my book. It's like someone sent a flare-up in her memory, and it stayed there. But it was many, many years. I didn't investigate it because, being young and stupid, I thought, oh, it can't possibly be true. I'm a skeptic, and it's all legend and ridiculous. I didn't do anything. I was married by the time I found it. This was in like 2001 or 2. Maybe the Cameron's films were out, or I was and I like books on the sea anyway. My wife brings a book in by a man called Archibald Gracie, one of the principal books of survivors of the Titanic. And she brought me Gracie's book. I said, oh, Gracie's book. I'd never read it. I said, this is great. She said, turn to page 98. I said, what? She said, go on, look, turn to page 98. And I looked, and it says, and on this lifeboat, you know, it said, and next to me, a certain James McGann got frostbite on his legs. And and as he told the New York Tribune. I went, what? He did survive. He did. There's a McGann on there, and that's James. It's James, my great-uncle. And so he must have been on it. Not only that, this lifeboat, stop me anytime I like, this lifeboat was the favorite. You've ever seen the film, it's in all the films, the upturned lifeboat. So it's collapsible B. It's the most famous lifeboat of them all that he seemed to be on with Gracie and Lightoller and the radio operator. So he seems to be on this one. I don't finally find the newspaper article that's alluded to in Archibald Gracie till 2012. And one night, with the wonders of the internet and online research, I'm going through, and I couldn't find anything in the New York Tribune. And then I realized, you idiot, if he's on the dock in New York, ready to come back, and he gives a press conference as one of these lowly seamen, it could have been syndicated. It was the biggest story in the world. Look in other newspapers. And I found it, I think, in the Yorkshire Post first. I've since found it about 50 times across the world. And what was so moving, it's where you might expect a reference that Gracie gave. He gives a sort of 2-page account of his experience, and an emotional one. The reason I'm here today is that explosion of a personal history. I'm from a family of actors. What we didn't realize 100 years before we ever hey diddly deed and thought we were the first people to become famous in our family, a guy had been at one of the most famous occasions and actually had given a big press conference, and we'd never known. And this man's life just came back. His feelings came back to life for me. I cried buckets when I saw it because I'd been searching for a while. But also it was so human. The accounts of it, jumping off with the captain, would you believe, at the last moments. And with that, and I'll finish here, with that I was able to, there are very famous books, and because there's so much detail about the Titanic, in a chapter in my book, I was able to, as it were, triangulate his story with Lightoll's story and Gracie's story principally, to work out minute by minute from about 10 to 2 to 20 past 2 where he is likely to have been on the deck and what he was doing. Because he gave an account, Gracie gave an account, and Lightoller gave an account. And then they all sort of come together. And so then I'm able to trace him pretty much till 8:30 the next morning when his lifeboat is rescued by the Carpathia.
Amazing. It's an incredible story. Stephanie, I wonder if I can ask you a little bit about writing about the Titanic, which I suppose we've all now done in different ways. Certainly I found that wealth of individual testimonies. I mean, you know, there are more than 700 survivors from the Titanic, and as Stephen says, they all have slightly different accounts, and some of them contradict each other, and trying to make sense of it can be complicated.
Yes.
But it's an unusual event, I suppose, in that we have such rich testimony coming out almost immediately. I mean, the day after the survivors arrive in New York, you have the start of the first of the 2 inquiries. And simultaneously, we have these newspaper articles and people are being quoted and giving their accounts and so on. I mean, how do you find, as a historian approaching this topic, how do you kind of deal with that wealth of first-person, individual history?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important part of the Titanic story, right? And something that we might, get into more as we work through this conversation is this idea of, why is it so famous, right? Why are we still here talking about this? We're not here talking about the Lusitania. We're not here talking about the Empress of Ireland, which is the other great disaster of that decade that very few people have even heard of. We still remain fascinated by the Titanic. I think a lot of that, I think there's a number of reasons. I think a lot of that, though, is because there is that 2-hour and 40-minute lag, right, between the ship hitting the iceberg and the ship sinking. So it hits the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., it sinks at 2:20 a.m., right, April 14th to 15th, 1912. And that is very distinctive from most other shipwrecks, right? The Lusitania sinks in 18 minutes. The Empress of Ireland sinks in 14 minutes, right? The Titanic, in some ways, because of its design, like the very design that dooms it, right, the very design that makes it vulnerable to that iceberg hitting in precisely the way that it does along the side of the ship, which is another, kind of fascinating aspect of the Titanic story that we've just had some new information revealed about that in kind of the last month or so. Because it doesn't have a transverse bulkhead, it doesn't tilt. It just sinks by the head very gradually, right? So it's very slow, and that allows a lot of those human stories to unfold, right? And so it's not just that there's 700 survivors, it's that there's 700 survivors who have 2 hours and 40 minutes, and then later for the ones who, those are the survivors, so they end up in the lifeboats, right? So they have hours and hours of stories to tell. And so the stories, inevitably people see different things, they feel different things, they're experiencing different things. It's a traumatic event, right? It affects people's memories, so people's stories in an immediate sense they tend to evolve over time. When I started working on this, I was never able to talk to a survivor of Titanic. I did talk to people in Belfast who saw it leave Belfast, right? And they had clearly told the story so many times at that point that there were kind of these standard elements to this kind of, individually mythic version of the Titanic that they were given. But I think that's what makes it such a human story, right? It's not a technical story. It's not the Lusitania is kind of a war story, right? It's a German U-boat hits the ship with a torpedo and it sinks. It's pretty comprehensible. The Titanic is a human story in so many ways. It's a story of human hubris in some ways, of designing, this ship that, even if it was never officially claimed by Harland and Wolff or by White Star that it was unsinkable, it was still kind of thought of as unsinkable, right? It was thought of as the cutting edge of maritime technology, so I think there's that. There's then the kind of human, perhaps, complacency, we might say, right, as they sort of sail through the North Atlantic, which is a very dangerous stretch of ocean under any circumstances, right? I mean, I just, came over a week ago on a flight that they never turned the seatbelt sign off the whole way, right? Because it was so bumpy because the weather's so bad. That was somewhat unusual, but still. It's a very dangerous stretch of ocean, and they're just sort of blasting through it at, they weren't quite going full speed because they didn't have enough coal, because there had been a coal strike, which is another part of the kind of human story of the Titanic. But they're still kind of blasting through this ice field because, ships don't hit icebergs and sink. It hasn't happened in decades. I mean, nobody remembers it happening. And then we get that, that just intense humanity of that 2 hours and 40 minutes, right? Of like, what do you do? Like, what are you thinking? And the slow horror, like, of it kind of unfolding, because nobody really knows right away what's happened except for maybe about 5 people, right? Captain Smith knows, Thomas Andrews, who's the chief designer from Harland and Wolff, who's on board the ship, he knows what's going to happen, right? And maybe 2 or 3 other people know. And it's this slow, dawning realization, because people don't feel the collision. A few people describe it feels like we ran over some marbles, or there's a little bit of a shake, but it's not much. And so it's just that slow, dawning horror. And we all wonder, right, what would we do? And I think we probably all think that we would have been far nobler than we would have actually been, right? Because most people aren't especially noble. But I think that's the story of the Titanic. And I think because of the unique way that the accident and the sinking take place, it gives opportunity for those kinds of stories to unfold.
Could I ask you a question, Stephanie? Just a technical question on extending to that. As a historian, this is such a famous story, like sort of Ripperology with Jack the Ripper. I mean, there are sites and there are places in which every sort of nut and bolt of the ship is examined and argued about. Approaching a subject like this, as a historian professionally, does the simple attention that's been given to it for a century, does that make your job more difficult or easier?
I mean, I think it does 2 things. One, yes, it means that you have to carve out space, right? There's not a lot of room for an historian to come back in and tell the story of Titanic again. You have to come up with a sort of new, what are you trying to say about it that's new? I came to it, as I was mentioning in our kind of previous conversation, that I came to it because there were actually 2 great British disasters of 1912. So there was Captain Scott of the Antarctic, right, who dies at the end of March. We don't know the exact date, but probably right around the 29th of March, 1912. And then the Titanic sinks roughly 2 weeks later. And I was kind of interested in these kind of 2 great disasters in this kind of pre-World War I era, right? What kind of cultural meaning did they have? I mean, I'm a cultural historian, right? And I think the second thing about Titanic that fascinates me is when a story gets this much attention, right? When we're still here talking about it more than 100 years later, I want to know why, right? I want to know what is it, because I think often what we remember about history, right? I mean, I have lived most of my life and I work in the American South, right? Which is a place that is very influenced by the history of the American Civil War, and people argue about it fiercely, right? What the meaning of that war was, what that war was about. And historians can say till they're blue in the face what the war was really about, right? And then other people will contest that, and they'll say, no, it wasn't, because they need it to mean something else in the present, often things that I wouldn't find particularly appealing, but I think what we think happened in history is often just as important as what actually happened in history. And I think the Titanic is one of those stories, right? The meaning of the story, because it relates so much to attitudes about social class, right? To attitudes about gender. And we can see those things changing over time, right? The whole meaning of women and children first, we now we're sort of tense about it, right? Because it's still seen as noble, I think, this idea that, that men stood aside. They didn't all, but many men stood aside and let women and children board the lifeboats. But it also makes us a little uncomfortable from a kind of feminist point of view, right? I mean, do we think, is that really what we should do now? Because, what is that saying about relations between men and women and the hierarchy between men and women? So I think one fascinating thing about the Titanic story is because it's such a human story, there's opportunities for the meaning of it to change. And so that's, once I once I kind of focused on the Titanic specifically, that was my interest, was thinking about, like, how has that story changed over time?
And even immediately, I mean, before the survivors have arrived in New York, that story is being shaped. I mean, you can go, you know, these days, you'd probably have found Uncle Jimmy's account in 5 minutes online, because you know, you can search all these newspaper archives. I mean, it's incredible. As well as the first-person testimony, there's also, you know, just vast quantities of newsprint. And you can see there very much these kind of ideas about how do we tell this story and what do we want this story to represent. So it's very important initially to say that women and children first worked. You know, so there are headlines that say things like all women and children saved, and then there are examples of famous men who died. And then it starts to come out as they look into it and they get more information. This slightly troubling data starts kind of creeping out that actually lots of women and children died, and actually lots of men survived. Yep. And then it seems like there's this real
one reason
kind of
why the gender figures are so lopsided, it's because of people's people like Stephen's uncle, who because the crew is so heavily male, and the crew die in greater numbers than anybody, and that's what starts to tilt the survive. That's also what, it's not that male passengers do survive in lower numbers than female and children passengers do, but it's that crew number that actually so heavily tilts the gender statistics that really gives credence to the idea of women and children first.
But it becomes a kind of problem then for men who've survived. And I mean, I'm interested, certainly when you read the transcripts of the inquiries, when you read the newspaper coverage at the time, I think it was very problematic to be a man who survived the Titanic. I mean, I'm interested, Stephen, your great uncle survives in the most remarkable and quite heroic circumstances. But initially for you, I mean, I remember, because your brother Paul presents a load of our shows, and he was the one who mentioned, oh, my great uncle survived the Titanic. And I have to say, my initial thought was, did he do something dodgy to survive that? Do you know what I mean? Like, is there a dark secret?
My
there that
exact
we don't know,
words at the time, you know, before I found out about him was, if that guy survived, he jumped off in a dress. That was my first. That was the cynic in me. And actually what did happen, and thankfully, because I do have some disreputable relatives in my family, and one of the great things about being an actor is that it is, when you look at history like drama, and we're talking about human lives, and you look at it culturally, you take that view of it. It doesn't matter if there are murderers there, if there are people, they're not you. They're characters, they've got motivation. What is motivating? That's what you heard a million times with cliches about actors. But it really matters in a story like this. You get rid of all of the idea of pedigree and, oh, I wouldn't like that story to get out. I didn't care. I wanted to know what happened. And what actually transpires is, by the time he gets up, it's about 10 to 2. So, you know, we're talking about these men and the disparity, as Stephanie says. So you've got these crew who are still very, very busy down in the bowels of the ship. People have been coming, so it hits trouble at 20 to 11? 20 to 12, is it?
20 to 12.
20 to 12, and it goes down at 20 past 2 in the morning. So it's 2 hours 40, is it? And if they are for a good hour and more, the guys in the engine room are in the engine room. The ones who are off duty are called in to make the engines safe, to bring the other boilers safe, because they're overheated. They were moving at nearly full speed. They had a lot of work to do down there. By the time he gets up, it's very late in the day. There are thousands of people ahead of him. Lots of people still milling around the deck, but the lifeboat, the upturned lifeboat that he gets on, is the very, very last lifeboat to be let, and it is for the use of the crew. So he doesn't get onto a lifeboat which was intended, originally designed for anybody else. It's called a collapsible because it has a canvas side, and it's like what we would sort of call flat pack. What you did was it's got an oak base, very strong, very heavy oak base, but you lifted the sides up from sort of canvas side so it could flat pack and be put on top of the radio room, top of the sort of like, or the captain's area at the top of, on the deck, on the ship. And they had to try and get that off while the ship was tilting at 2 o'clock with 20 minutes to go. They had to try and prise it free. And it was very difficult. They tried to bring it down by balancing it on oars to sort of slide it down to the deck. And that's when it went upside down. It slid down and slid the wrong way and then floated out upside down. What saved their lives is they had an air pocket inside. But that was part of the problem. When people later go to try and jump on it to be rescued, they swim to it. There's only about 30 men, and it was all men on that lifeboat, who could get on, and it's beginning to wobble. There's only so many you could fit on what's basically an upturned thing, so it's the hull of this thing. And there's only about 30 of them to do before it gets dangerously wobbly, and the air pocket threatens to be lost. It will switch over, they will all die. And so then they face the most agonizing part of the story for me with Jimmy, which is they did start to repel people trying to get on. The 30 people who'd managed to get on, to survive, other people had to die. People were swimming up to it. Some people apparently were very gentlemanly, but they were his workmates. They were other firemen and trimmers. And so then over the next hour, the most horrific scene is that there's cries for a good half an hour at least of people in the water crying out for help. And the lifeboats are there and they can't go and save them because they fear being lost themselves. And so gradually the noises get quieter and quieter and then people die. But you had to imagine the sound of that extended, the sound of human beings dying, begging you for help. And that's his experience too. So it's things like that, those things which mark a human, which mark what they do, and later that's what makes actors interested in playing people. This is, you know, the choice, what would I do, where would we go, how would we respond? You know.
And undoubtedly, I mean, we don't necessarily know much about how your great uncle processed that, except he does have this line in his testimony where he says, I wasn't that keen on living myself. Yeah. So he obviously has quite a bleak moment. But, you know, in a period before we understand PTSD, before we understand this kind of trauma, I mean, this is 2 years before the First World War, their way of kind of comprehending this stuff is primitive from our perspective. And yet there are many accounts going forward of people who very clearly are having flashbacks to Titanic, this is a trauma that they're going to carry throughout their lives.
Yeah, I mean, Frederick Fleet, right, who's the other, so one of the radio operators, Harold Bride, dies, Frederick Fleet survives, right, but he commits suicide about 10 years later. So I think there's that. I think the story about, sort of collapse of the lifeboat B is it's revealing, right? Because normally those guys are kind of exempted from the you must have sneaked off in a dress sort of thing, yeah. because they're regarded as this thing kind of floated off the ship at the end. I mean, it was put in, it was indeed on top of the deck house. It was in a place. I mean, it tells you how little they thought they were going to need these lifeboats, that they put a lifeboat in a place that you couldn't even get it off. Yeah. So they barely managed to get it loose, and then it floats off upside down at the absolute last minute. And then these guys, mostly from the crew at that point. I think entirely from the crew, as you said, sort of climb on. Second Officer Lightoller, right, is the one who kind of takes charge of it, and he's got everybody all night going lean this way and lean that way to keep the air pocket from dissipating from under the boat. And a few of them die in the night, but most of them, thanks mostly to kind of Lightoller's heroic efforts, do survive. And so they get kind of exempted from this very rigid gender code, right? But I think a lot of these men don't, right? So I mean, the most famous case is J. Bruce Ismay, right? Who's the director of the White Star Line, the operator of the owner and operator of Titanic. He's on board for the maiden voyage. Ismay, kind of half-heartedly helps to load some lifeboats. He then, it's one of the classic cases where there's nobody around to get on the lifeboat, and so he, at the end, with a lifeboat that was going to go off with 20 empty places, jumps in a lifeboat, right? There's nothing by any normal moral standard wrong with what he does. He doesn't knock some child aside and jump into a boat or something like that. He just gets into a seat that would have been empty. For the rest of his life, he is hounded mercilessly for this cowardice. There's another kind of upper-class British person on the ship, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon. He kind of innocently, when he's on a lifeboat with some of the members of the crew, and the members of the crew say to him, we've lost everything, because they've lost all of their possessions. These are working class guys in the early 20th century, they don't have a lot. He's a rich guy, and he says, oh, okay, I'll give you all £5, and he does. And then this looks like later that he's sort of bribed them, like it gets interpreted later, I would say, as he's bribed them to keep their mouths shut about how he sneaked his way into a lifeboat or something. And so he comes under a lot of approbation when, again, as far as I can tell, he's not done anything wrong. So I think there are these sorts of stories, and we have to think about how we impose our own, and we still do, right? When we analyze the Titanic story, we still look at it and we go, oh, who was heroic? You know, we still tend to think that, you know, Ben Guggenheim saying we are dressed in our best and are going to go down like gentlemen. Well, he's got his valet is with him, right? Well, the we includes the valet. Well, did the valet want to go down like a gentleman? I mean, I don't really know, you know? It's like nobody asked him. I mean, maybe he wanted to get in the lifeboat and didn't want to stand there by Ben Guggenheim's side looking dignified as the ship went down, right? But we don't know that, and we forget kind of that sort of aspect of the story. So we still do that, right? We still interpret everything that happens through this code of kind of, you know, maybe how we think about gender, how we think about class, and also just how we think about morality, right? And that's a fundamental part of the kind of myth of the Titanic.
It's also, I suppose, a story where, you know, we sort of see Titanic as the end of an age. We see it as kind of the end of this Edwardian age, partly in terms of the very obvious class stratification of the ship. It feels like something from a kind of previous time. But I think also, you know, talking about that condensed time frame, that couple of hours, you know, 2 hours and 40 minutes, and the human experience of surviving those stories. They are, I mean, we have a podcast called Real Survival Stories. People love survival stories. There's a reason. They're very dramatic, and then there's a very kind of, you know, you're tested in extremis in some ways if you go through these kind of things. But I think there's the survival impact or instinct, and then there's also the kind of Edwardian social mores of the time. And what you see in the kind of Titanic inquiries is these two things failing to mesh somehow. So you get these stories that come out. So for example, the fact that the lifeboats don't, with one exception, go back and try to rescue people even though they've got loads of empty spaces, they just can't get it. I mean, literally, if you read the transcripts, the senator who's conducting the inquiry asked the same question about 6 times. He's like, you didn't go back? And the guy's like, no, we didn't go back. And he's like, well, you didn't go back. You know, you waited. And he's like, yes, I waited. I told you I waited, because he waited until the cries of the dying people had died down because they didn't want to get swamped. And similarly, you know, what happened to your great uncle pushing these guys away in the water. I mean, Lightoller is actually asked about that not specifically. He's asked if anyone tried to get on the boat, and he says, no one else got on the boat. And they push him. They're like, yeah, but did anyone try to get on the boat? And he says, not to my recollection, or something like that. You know, he basically lies. There's no way around it. If we know what happened on that boat and we know he was involved in it, he's asked a pretty direct question and lies about it. So there is this kind of sense that the inquiries, the media interest at the time, the stories that people are telling, yes, there's getting to the truth of what happened, but there's also like, what truths can we cope with then and now? And I suppose that's another reason why Titanic the story of Titanic shifts and changes over the decades, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting, that, isn't it? There's one little postscript which it sort of gets missed, where I would like to read more. Basically, Jimmy, he gets to New York very quickly. He gets to New York. He's got frostbite on his legs. And apparently, there are lots of benefactors, because what happens is the Californian sails past, but they are rescued by a ship called the Carpathia, which is returning to Europe, I think, from New York, turns back around, goes back to New York with the survivors. So they get back into New York Harbor. It's all mad on the port. And as part of this, some benefactors, Catholic benefactors, with the crew, with the firemen and trimmers, a lot of them being Liverpool Irish Catholics, they pick some of these people up and escort them down in their cars to St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village, which only closed, I think, in 1980. And he is healed of his frostbite in St. Vincent. But then the inquiry that Duncan mentions, the American inquiry, starts. Now, someone like Jimmy is not considered important enough for that inquiry, so he's put back on a ship called the Lapland, the SS Lapland, to take them back to Europe. A lot of the crew, the lowly crew members, including him, go back and actually sail into Plymouth. And the reason I'm mentioning this is there's another interesting sort of like inflection point in history. Because when they get back in, as you know with inquiries in this cynical age, when people are running inquiries, we're all cynics, and we all think, yeah, what are they trying to hide? Let's try and expose them, and we get our journalists to try and expose the truth. What are they trying to cover up? Now, when they sail back into Plymouth, the first people out, before the ship even comes in, they have to wait in the harbour. And a ship comes out from the White Star Line containing White Star Line people to get them to sign essentially a kind of affidavit to say what they did and where they did it, or else they couldn't come home, they couldn't land. Now, on that ship, there was a nascent union, the Union of Sea Workers. So we're beginning in the early 20th century to start the idea of unionism. So they didn't have a union, and this union was quite cute because it was very crude in the beginning. They do things like a seaman going away would usually drink his wages away, and you could give, instead of pawning your stuff and drinking it all the way, you could give a bit to the union, and they would look after your wife and kids while you were away, so you didn't spend it all, you know, when you got back into the port. They would start to look after the welfare. It was the very beginning of look after the welfare of the men. Reason I'm mentioning this is the White Star men didn't allow the union to come with them when they were going out to the boat, which was still out in the port. There's a whole incident that happened where they grab a megaphone, get another boat, the union, and take a boat out and go, "Don't listen to a word they say! Stay there!" And creating trouble. All this happened with the guys still out. And then eventually they're allowed to get on board, and they are allowed to speak to the seamen themselves, and then they're allowed to come in and they give their statements or whatever. So you're just beginning to see a little bit of a new thing of industrial relations beginning to happen. Very early days. So the Titanic story, also quietly, some of the lesser known, they intersect these other parts of it. You know, one other little peculiarity is my great uncle in the records. He's paid off in the end. He's on the list of those paid off from the Titanic. He's only paid for the days until it's hit by the iceberg.
That's right.
Because, of course, he wasn't working the next day.
Yeah.
You can't pay him for what he doesn't do.
They stopped the pay at 2:20 in the morning
pay.
on April 15th. They stopped the pay when the ship sank.
Yeah.
That's absolutely
So,
right.
you know, attitudes, different age, different ideas, different attitudes. Lots of those little things, you know. Just...
And, I mean, this thing about them stopping the pay, looked at charitably, that's the reason. There's another kind of mini scandal when they arrive in New York that Bruce Ismay, who's the chairman of the White Star Line, is very keen to get the crew back to England like the next day. He's like, we want to get the crew home. We don't want to leave them in New York. And I can't help thinking there's this big inquiry kicking off. You know, there does seem to be, there's an element of kind of damage limitation. And funnily enough, one of our experts who you heard in that clip, Tim Moulton, who is a Titanic obsessive, but in his day job is works in damage limitation PR, basically. And I feel like this is almost a new phenomenon, I suppose, at the time of the Titanic. But there's definitely a sense of trying to manage perception at these inquiries from White Star, from people like Lytle. I mean, Lytle says he had his hand on the whitewash brush when he was testifying. Yeah. But I'm kind of interested in what role actually your great uncle Jimmy, his testimony plays in that. Because I think the reason, when you look at that account, and as you say, it's syndicated in many different papers, the reason they're interested in it is because, I mean, you know, essentially it's because he was with the captain. That's why, that's right. I mean, we want to hear Jimmy's story because we're interested in, like, what was it like to be an engine room worker on Titanic? But at the time, it's very much because I think another one of these sort of crisis points is, how do we explain what happened with Captain Smith? Did he go down with the ship? Did he, I mean, obviously he went down with the ship in that he died, but, you know, was he heroic? Did he kind of live up to the standards of the Navy and of the sort of seafaring tradition and all of these sorts of things? And I think it is a problem for people at the time that there's a lack of information about Captain Smith, that he seems quite sort of absent. So maybe that's why something like Jimmy's account of him in those final moments is something that people are kind of clinging to. This is really important somehow.
And something Jimmy clings to as well. Jimmy is very keen to tell the story. I want to share something with you about this, about history in general, why I love history, why I love being on panels like this, and why I love the experience of history and the human things. When a disaster happens, if I could just share with you, I was in a football disaster. And there's one human psychological thing I identify with Jimmy here. Till the end of his life, what I do know, for a reason I won't go into, it'll take too long. Jimmy, till the end of his life, which was unfortunately only a few years later after he survived, he was dead by 1918. But he was very exercised by the story of the captain, by what he'd witnessed. Because what you witness when you go through the trauma of an event where many people die, what you witness I think takes on a huge amount of importance to your own sort of mental stability and health. When you see a variance in the press or a variance in the public story from what you saw with your own eyes, it can become a little bit of a fixation to hold on to something that you saw. And if you saw a portion of the story, like him and the captain, and he knew where the captain was at that time, and he knew, I do know that he was very exercised in a way that I was exercised post this football disaster by the way the story was being told afterwards. I can share something with my ancestor about it became a sort of fixation, this idea, and I think you hold on to your version of the truth as well, because we've been discussing, it's fascinating with Stephanie, and the cultural history, and it's about the nature of what do we believe of the Titanic, the truth and the way truth runs in against myth. But the truth for those individuals, it doesn't mean they all actually happened exactly like that. It's in the confusion of war, as it were. But still, truth itself to the witnesses takes on a whole different meaning. I just wanted to share that through my own life experience.
I think with the captain too, I think another aspect of this is that there's a sort of national one, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because this is at a moment, right, when, maybe Britain's national and maritime supremacy is just starting to become a source of a little bit of anxiety, right? I mean, Britain is still 100% a great power. But there's a little, there's competition coming from the Germans, right? Which has been taking place in terms of not just the dreadnoughts that we all know about, but in terms of commercial vessels as well, right? So the Germans have been building kind of bigger and better passenger ships, which is in some ways why the Titanic exists. It's built to compete with those German ships. So there's more and more competition, and there's also this sense of growing competition with the U.S., right? Which is obviously going to become even more of a thing in the kind of interwar period. And so there is definite tension between the United States and Britain. Part of the reason why those guys are spirited out of the U.S. so quickly is because the U.S. is saying, we're going to figure out what happened. And the British are like, ooh, we don't really know if we want to be party to that, right? And so the American inquiry is much feistier than the British inquiry is. And that's kind of what Lightoller was alluding to when he says that the British inquiry is a little bit of a whitewash, right? It's a little bit of a let's not talk about this. Too much. And so I think there's that aspect to it. I think Captain Smith plays into that, right? Because this idea of the heroic captain, right? It's, there's this long British tradition, right, of naval heroes. Nelson, right? We might think about something like that, somebody like that. And Captain Smith doesn't really fit that in terms of like how he seems to actually behave, because he does disappear. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows what he's doing. He's not on the bridge at the time the collision takes place. And then he's very elusive for the rest of the time. They kind of lose track of him. He doesn't appear to do anything particularly heroic, anything particularly helpful in a way. And so then we start afterwards getting these stories of him being heroic. Is that actually your relative who comes up with a story where he waves at people in the collapsible B and says, "Good luck, boys," And
oh, you've done your duty.
You've done your duty.
And all of that.
I think my theory is, I mean, we don't know, do we? I don't want to say that.
No.
I don't think Jimmy made that up. It doesn't read like something someone made up. But I mean, there is a sense, there are these stories that seem very far-fetched of Captain Smith like swimming with babies under his arms and handing him babies,
right? I mean,
you can't do that.
And I think that's one reason that therefore it seems like this is part of an agenda to like rehabilitate Captain Smith, who in other versions was drunk, was having a breakdown, was like completely derelict in regard to
there's
his
a whole
duty.
campaign to revive. I mean, one of my favorite bits about Captain Smith is afterwards there's a campaign to put a statue of him up, but he's from Stoke-on-Trent, right? Which is not it's not like the most posh place in Britain, right? I think that's a safe thing to say about Stoke-on-Trent, right? Lovely in many ways, but not the poshest place in Britain, right? Stoke. And so instead what happens, because it's these kind of wealthy people who want to commemorate the heroism of the captain, they actually put the statue in Lichfield, right? Which has nothing to do with Captain Smith, but that's why it's there, is because they're trying to transform him into this kind of conventional sort of naval hero type. We can't have him in Stoke because that doesn't really work. That would not fit the kind of heroic image of the great great British naval hero that we want to have, so they put it in Lichfield randomly.
Sorry, can I just, Stephanie, he was involved in some incidents before in his career.
He was, yeah. He had all actually, I mean, and part of that legend, of the, whatever it is, the story of the insurance fraud, that it's not actually the Titanic,
so he had
the Olympic.
form as well.
It's because Captain Smith
Crashed another one of these ships, basically.
he had put a giant hole in the side of Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, by turning the wrong way, and then a Royal Naval vessel ran into it, right?
But I don't. I think it's because he's so absent in that period, and there aren't actually that many accounts of what he was doing in those final couple of hours, and because the accounts that are being published often do seem so far-fetched that it's easy to dismiss them, like the handing over babies. But I mean, just to say, to give the benefit of the doubt, what Jimmy's version is that they both were holding onto a child as the water was coming up, which seems plausible to me, and then they let go of it. And this is what is so tragic about his story, that when they hit the water, it's so cold, they can't hold on to these kids anymore, and the kids die. I mean, it seems to me like that might be, if we accept that that's a true story, which I'd like to hope that it is, and we can't really disprove it, that then gets translated into the captain sort of swimming along with a baby under his arm and saying, here, take this baby, which is a kind of, again, is a sort of nice fantasy version of that quite bleak, awful survival experience. And I mean, it's interesting, the inquiries, it seems like what they don't want to come, the truth that they don't want to come out is these kind of dark aspects of the Titanic story. And so what they want to come out is the kind of, women and children first, and the captain went down with the ship, and all these kind of slogans, and basically. And the band played
and
the band played on, that's another good one. I mean, it's interesting, you were alluding to the Hillsborough disaster. It's almost the opposite in that instance, where it's like the tabloid press is kind of, and I don't know what this must have been like for you as, coming from Liverpool and being there, that it's the Liverpool fans who are they're sort of trying to do the opposite. They're trying to say these people behaved appallingly badly and did all these awful things, none of which was true, it seems, So it's kind of, the inquiry is kind of going in the opposite direction, but again, it's about like distorting the truth of what really happened.
Well, we need to have a meaning, right? And we need to have so I mean, unfortunately, the Hillsborough disaster story is these people behaved badly, and that's what gives us an explanation, right, for why it happened, which is somehow more soothing than it was this terrible kind of random thing, right? And I think a lot of that, whether it's positive or negative, I think it's always like a search for meaning with this.
I think we're so much wiser nowadays in the internet age about an incorrect story getting its boots on and off well before you can correct it. I think we're a lot more, I'd like to think we're a bit more wise about that, but this was at a time before then.
I'm not sure.
When through print, a story could very well and truly get established before you can start to unpick that story, And when we mustn't get involved in that. But yes, just generally, the psychology of it, how it affected me psychologically, is quite traumatic. If you see something that you saw with your own eyes, and not only that, there were thousands of people on this ship. There were 40,000 people saw certain things, which in an inquiry, we're talking about whitewashing and inquiries, there were 2 or 3 inquiries of the football disaster where they were telling me that things happened only for 15 minutes, that 40,000 of us saw happening for an hour. So you're looking at that, and it's like somebody is gaslighting you. You say, no, that's not what you saw. And you go, and that's where the sort of the stress and the trauma comes from. Then you fixate on. So afterwards, in the inquiries, the British fury at the American inquiry, jumping in and being feisty in New York before the British could get and put a sort of a safe seal around it, how that might have affected ordinary people involved in it, and how they felt that their story is being told or not told. That, although they're very different occasions, but there are some commonalities psychologically, I think.
Well, I'm sure the three of us could sit here chatting about Titanic for many hours, but I am aware that it's probably time to throw things out to the audience. If there are any questions here, or also any questions coming in from online, I think. Should we start with an online question?
Yeah, we'll start with online. We have one question from Karina. Karina asks, if you could ask a passenger or a crew member a question from that time, who would you choose and what would you ask? And the second question, I'll just bundle them together. What lesser-known stories or fates on board do you personally move? What personally moves you the most?
Who wants to go first on that
I'll
one?
go first. I
go
mean,
ahead.
obviously, the most obvious answer to the first one would be if I could speak to my great uncle. If I could just talk to him, if by some magic wand it could be waved and I had 15 minutes to talk to him, what would I ask him? I'd ask him how it felt to be on that boat, how he feels about it now, how it made it. He had a child when he came home, how it changed his view, because he got married and then had a child before he died. It was only 4 years, for 6 years afterwards. You know, he'd already had it. And how did it make him think about his wife, his decisions, and what happens afterwards? How was he affected by it? That would be one, you know. Anybody else?
I would probably want to, it's kind of a boring answer, but I would probably want to know if Murdoch, who is in charge of steering the ship at the moment when they get the message from the crow's nest, if he thought of doing anything else and sort of what was going through his head as he saw the ship kind of approaching the iceberg and turning ever so slowly, right? Because it's a big clumsy piece of metal, the Titanic, right? It's the rudder's too small. It doesn't corner well, right? And he must have, you know, being used to other ships, right? Never having been on a ship this big, he must have been like, dang it, why aren't you turning faster, right? And whether he thought about actually just ramming it into the iceberg, you know, whether that entered his head. I doubt it did, but I would just like to know what his thought process was as he gets this kind of devastating message that there's an iceberg sort of straight in front of the ship. For me, the unknown stories, the story that I somehow find very moving is actually the story of Thomas Andrews, who's the guy from Harland and Wolff, from the Harland and Wolff Guarantee Party, who's on board the ship. I mean, maybe because in the Cameron film, I think he's kind of well played with a terrible, he sounds like he's from Cork, not Ulster accent by an American actor. But otherwise, I think it's a quite kind of, to me, it was a kind of a moving portrayal, and just thinking about, I think that the story of Titanic, you know, something we haven't really talked about, is so tied in with politics in Ireland in the early 20th century, being built at this Protestant-dominated shipyard in Belfast. I mean, I find that part of the Titanic story, as a British historian, really interesting. And I think, to me, the story of kind of that Harland and Wolff Guarantee Party and Thomas Andrews specifically, I find very interesting and would actually like to kind of know more about it.
I was going to say, I mean, I don't know that we would actually learn anything by talking to Thomas Andrews, but I do feel he's the person who, he has this almost unimaginable experience that he's worked on designing this ship. He's the guy who knows the ship better than anyone. And there is a moment where he is the only person on that ship who knows it's going to sink. Yeah. And before he passes that information on to the captain and to Bruce Ismay, and you know, as we talked about, it takes a long time for that message to really get through to a lot of the passengers. I mean, I don't know what he'd say if you asked him what was that like. I mean, Andrews famously doesn't try to survive the sinking. He's sort of seen in this kind of catatonic state in one of the lounges staring at a painting. I mean, what must have gone through his mind in those few hours? And from being the person who's the only person who knows the truth and knowing that you've got to then get that information out there, manage that flow of information. I don't know. In terms of...
And be thinking that I designed this ship.
Yeah,
right?
well, yeah, also the responsibility
did I
for
mess
it.
up,
Did I make a mistake?
Right? He's the one person also who probably feels some... I mean, maybe, you know, people felt it, you know, who were steering the ship, but I mean... Yeah. He's got to be aware at that point that there's things I could have done in the design of this ship that might have prevented that from happening, right? There, you know, if it had a transverse bulkhead, even if the horizontal bulkheads had gone if they had been capped off at the top, right? Because that's the whole problem, is that they're not. And so when the bow goes down, the water comes over. It's like an ice cube tray, right? Leaning, and the water goes over and over and over. So if they had put a bulkhead across the top, then the ship was. So he's also grappling with that.
Yeah, for sure.
Which I think is super interesting.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of like someone who might actually provide information that we don't have, I do think it would be nice to know, and I guess you'd have to ask Captain Smith. One of the things, things that comes up later is there's this one passenger who testifies that Bruce Ismay, who's the guy whose life is kind of ruined basically by all of this, partly because he got in the lifeboat controversially. Many people felt he should have gone down with the ship, partly because there was a feeling, and actually the American inquiry, it's like that they're convinced that somehow this is his fault, that he told the captain to go faster. There's one passenger who says she overheard a conversation where he was talking to the captain about speed, and she describes his demeanour as dictatorial. But no one else knows what happened in that conversation. Ismay doesn't confirm that, and Captain Smith is no longer around. And what the American inquiry concludes is that they actually can't prove that Ismay did anything to contribute to the accident, but they believe that him being there and basically being the boss influenced the captain's judgment. So I would quite like to ask Captain Smith, and he probably wouldn't tell the truth even if he was alive, who knows, what did having the boss there with you in this kind of slightly ambiguous role, like in theory he's a passenger and yet he keeps turning up on the bridge and kind of, getting involved, did that in any way affect the decisions that you made as a naval captain? Because of course the answer is, anyone asked that question is probably going to say no. But I think it's an interesting question, and there's no way for us to know the answer to that. And it does really go to this question of who's to blame and who did what wrong, and and do we blame Captain Smith or do we try and rehabilitate him? Yeah. Should we have a question in the room? If anyone's got a question. Yeah.
Thank you. It may be that some were saved by dying, if that's remotely the right phrase. But my question is, did anyone face criminal or civil charges as a result of Titanic?
I know there was a senator in America who wanted Ismay to be pulled up on criminal charges, which I don't think that was ever going to happen. I mean, he was a British citizen in the States, and I don't think there was a kind of mechanism for that. I mean, there were inquiries as to sort of liability and financial kind of business, I think. But no, I don't think any... There's no, I don't even know if corporate manslaughter existed then. Do you know? I mean, what the
It's an interesting question. I don't think anyone was sort of brought to justice, as it were. And it's this interesting thing, isn't it, about the part blame makes in closure and our search, and we do it now, our search for blame, the nature of relationship of blame and responsibility and ourselves and the truth, and sometimes life she complex, and sometimes disasters she happen, and there's a collection of awful things which if you could do it again you wouldn't do. And when do we stop? When do we need, like in the law, to ascribe blame? When does someone have to be punished before we can move on?
I mean, I think there's analysis of the captain of the... I mean, I don't think it remotely rises to anything criminal, but there's the captain of the Californian, right, which is the ship that's probably, right, he talks about, well, we could see these lights, and then these lights started kind of tilting in the water, but it couldn't possibly have been the Titanic, right? I mean, and he sees kind of flashes that are probably the flares going up, the distress flares going up from the Titanic, right? But it couldn't possibly have been the Titanic. And he just sort of, goes to bed, and his radio operator doesn't wake him up. I mean, it seems to me, it's certainly extremely complacent, borderline negligent, particularly, again, when we compare it to, what Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia does, which is turns the ship around and goes, just heck bent for election, right? To try to get back to the Titanic wreck site. An interesting part about that I was thinking when you were talking about it before, Stephen, is also when they're trying to decide what to do with the Titanic passengers, right? And one thought, because the Olympic is actually going in the opposite direction, Titanic's sister ship, and it's saying, do you want us to come to the site and take on the passengers? And then they realize if people see the Olympic, they're going to think it's the Titanic, right? They're going to think, oh my God, the ship didn't really sink, and it's going to add to some of that trauma that we've talked about. So they actually do talk about that, recognize the effect that it is likely to have on the Titanic survivors, and decide to tell the Olympic to stay away.
Ismay actually has an amazing... when he's asked about it, he says it could harrow their souls or something. That's the way he describes it. I mean, it's a very powerful description of what that might... that weird experience, because it is weird that these ships look identical. I mean, even for years later, these other ships that look like Titanic kind of plying that route. But so they knew the survivors would struggle with that. That they wouldn't be reassured by basically put on an identikit Titanic, but without their husbands.
Well, there's that too, right? They've just been on the identical ship that sank, and now they're going to put them on it.
But it's interesting because it then also plays into these conspiracy theories that you mentioned, the fact that these ships are identical. And I wonder whether that idea of this kind of search for blame, that we want to blame someone, and actually this is an accident, and yes, lots of people did things that in retrospect they probably shouldn't have done, but there isn't an obvious guilty party. if you buy into a conspiracy theory and you think, JP Morgan sank the Titanic to kill off his business rivals, which is one theory that was going around, then there you go. You've got your villain. You've got your kind of easy figure of blame.
No, that's interesting. On the very personal level, so just while we're talking about the Carpathia and things, what was happening meanwhile, thanks to Archibald Gracie's story mainly. So by the morning, the dawn's breaking. At night, what saved the lifeboats largely was, if people don't know, the sea was amazingly calm. If the Atlantic Ocean had have been swelling the way it could swell, or if the weather was really bad, we'd have lost a lot more people, including Collapsible B. And even though they were trimming it, that is keeping it level, by the early hours of the morning as dawn was breaking, it was beginning to sink. The air pocket was going. It was getting harder to keep it level. They were having to stand up and be very careful to balance it. They were in jeopardy when the Carpathia then finally they can ensure that, yes, there is somebody coming, there is a ship coming. And so they had to keep up then. And just before the end of Collapsible B, they did transfer to another lifeboat. They were the last people rescued at 8:30. But before even the Carpathia reached them, they, out of safety, Lightoller got another lifeboat to approach, and they managed to scramble, quite dangerously, managed to scramble across to a lifeboat which had more spaces in, to risk that because the Collapsible B was in such a mess. So it was a close-run thing. And the Carpathia steaming the way it did probably save my great-uncle as well, because that's one of the most vulnerable lifeboats.
Yeah, the only thing I would say about that flat calm on the North Atlantic, which is absolutely right, that night, is if it had not been so flat calm, they probably wouldn't have hit the iceberg in the first place, because it's the flat calm that prevents there from being the white caps of the waves breaking against the base of the iceberg. And icebergs are not often white, right? And that's the theory with the Titanic iceberg, is it was actually what we would think of as sort of black ice or clear ice. Right, so it didn't stand out, so they didn't see it until too late. So it's possible that if there had been more waves that night, they would have seen the iceberg soon.
So the next morning, it was beginning to get choppy apparently as well. So it was picking up again.
Yeah, Lightoller definitely commented.
But at the same time, I mean, the other thing is, I think we tend to think that there was one iceberg. The next morning, when the sun comes up, they're surrounded by icebergs. You know, so it's not. Yes, you can sort of say, oh, if this had happened, and if that had happened, and what if this, and what if that, they might not have hit that iceberg. But there were a lot of icebergs. You know, that's not to say they would have hit one of them, but it's not quite such a kind of quirky combination of these two things just happening to coincide as it might seem. Shall we have another? Yeah, over here. Question.
Just a quick question. Will the ship have been insured?
By Lloyd's, I would.
By Lloyd's?
Yeah,
but it was underinsured, I think.
Lloyd's shipping insurance was a massive industry.
Must have been a huge stuff, you're right.
And it was positioned as unsinkable. That was the big strap line, wasn't it?
Though not officially. That was in the press.
But would it have been seen as an act of God, and therefore the insurance not valid?
I don't know legally an act of God. I know in Ireland there was some discussion of that, right, Stephanie, about the... there was this idea that it was this kind of... Because there was this, again, a conspiracy theory that the hull number of Titanic looked at in a mirror said no Pope, and that it was because Harland and Wolff, where the ship was built, was this kind of... in Belfast, they employed almost exclusively Protestants, and so there was this idea that, that this was a kind of Protestant outrage somehow. And so, according to that theory, I guess... It's the Catholic God who, sinks this ship, which, of course, is full of Irish Catholic
which
migrants.
is 250 Irish Catholic migrants,
so,
and about 10 Ulster Protestants. Logic
but
pulled apart a little bit.
But I think that, I mean, it was insured. It was underinsured. That's another reason there were some conspiracy theories about them sinking a different ship and so on. But also, I think so after the two inquiries, there was then a limitation of liability inquiry, which I think was about essentially, if someone could be held to blame, it makes a massive difference to if it's considered an accident. And I think the outcome of that, if I'm correct, because my head was slightly swimming when I spent a few weeks trying to read through all these inquiries, I think the outcome was basically no one was officially to blame, and therefore it was treated as an accident. But there were, I mean, I don't know a huge amount. I don't know, Stephanie, if you know much about the payouts. There were people who lost parents who received there were funds, and there was kind of financial.
There was certainly private fundraising
compensation.
afterwards to compensate people, which was a very normal way of kind of dealing with these kinds of tragedies. So yes, there would have certainly been kind of private charitable organization. I mean, in Southampton, because there's hundreds of people who die in Southampton. I mean, the effect on Southampton is just massive, right? I mean, it's just. I mean, I was driven around once by the president of the British Titanic Society in Southampton, and it's like every street is like, yeah, someone died here, someone died here, someone died here, because all the crew, that's where they're all based.
My great uncle was based in Southampton.
Yeah, because the
ships
had moved there from Liverpool. That's because Southampton has become, as it is now, the main port for transatlantic shipping. Largely because the Isle of Wight gives a double high tide every day, so they can get big ships in and out of Southampton twice a day instead of once a day. That's why it's a.
What killed the business in Liverpool? The White Star Line still had their offices in Liverpool, but the ships were moving to Southampton.
And all these Liverpudlian guys are going and basing themselves in Southampton.
Going with it. Well, they worked around the world anyway, so they went where the work was.
But there's an amazing map. If you go to the museum in Southampton, look at their Titanic exhibit, where Jimmy McGann is up on the wall.
He is.
You can see where everyone in Southampton, they've got a map on the floor, and they've got red dots for every crew member who died. And it absolutely brings that to life. You know what Stephanie's saying, that you couldn't move in Southampton without running into a widow or a bereaved family. It's just
too quickly, Duncan. It's important to mention that both Southampton and Belfast, right? The kind of museum commemoration of the Titanic that you're talking about is fairly recent in both places. In Southampton, it was just a trauma, right? And it was, and for a place that is, a lot of its economy depends on big ships. Maybe a little less now than then, but still. It's a major port, and so they don't really want to highlight, right, the history of this kind of maritime disaster, but it's also just this trauma of all these people who died. It took a long time before Titanic was a major presence in Southampton. I mean, if you go to the dock that it set sail from, there's a tiny little plaque. Belfast was the same way, right? I mean, I don't know if anyone here has been to the glitzy new kind of Titanic museum in Belfast, but that is a glitzy and new museum, right? Before that, because of the kind of sectarian history that Titanic was associated with in Belfast, nobody really wanted to talk about it much. So it's really only the kind of peace process and the Good Friday Agreement that has made Titanic now something that I think Belfast can really emphasize in terms of promoting tourism to the city.
Yeah.
Have we got any more online questions coming in?
No questions, but there are a couple of just statements of support, and I think people are just highlighting that they've been touched by the connections between, particularly the Irish-Liverpool connection.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Little quirks in every big event. I don't know if some people don't know that Lightoller went on to be in charge of one of those little boats in Dunkirk.
He did.
He took one of those little boats across, the same Officer Lightoller. There was another guy whose name escapes me, who in his seafaring career survived 3 shipwrecks, the Titanic being one of them. There's 3 separate times in his career he escaped. He was the luckiest guy ever, and he was shipwrecked 3 times.
Lightoller, I think, is in terms of the people you might want to ask questions to or whatever, he is a very interesting character, I think, because he's quite a controversial figure. Yeah. And he can be played in very different ways if you look at different film versions of Titanic and so on. He's very controversially, he's the guy who doesn't allow husbands to go with their wives, even when there are empty seats.
He's women and children only.
He's women and exactly. Women and children first to him means basically men are not going anywhere near these lifeboats, even if they're half empty.
Children first. Lightoller is mostly responsible for letting those boats go off first.
But to the extent that even teenage boys, as far as he's concerned, are men, and therefore he expects them to die. So Lightoller, controversially, probably causes a lot of people to die who could have escaped in those empty spaces. Then, when it comes to Collapsible B, this kind of hard-as-nails tough guy is exactly what they need to make these awful decisions. They actually need someone like that. But I do think it's interesting because he's this person who potentially kills a lot of people by being so strict with his rules about the lifeboats, that then when it comes to Dunkirk, he takes his yacht out, and it's a yacht that's supposed to hold 20 or 30 people at the most or something, and he brings back over 100 people. So he's almost like, I don't know, I can't help feeling, and maybe this is a bit fanciful, he sort of redeems himself. All those lives that were lost on Titanic,
I love those nuances.
He saves them at Dunkirk.
It's like the Captain Bligh thing in Mutiny on the Bounty. Over recent years, the way history changed, so in all the old films, he's the evil guy, fighting Paul Fletcher Christian, he's the nasty officer who causes the mutiny. And actually what Bligh's possibly more famous for now is what he actually did, is the most astonishing rescue. When they ditch him in this boat, he does one of the most famous and astonishing trips of thousands of miles in basically a rowboat. And he steers the survivors to safety against all the odds, like a sort of a Shackleton level of event, very, very famous. And so two sides to the man, two sides to the story. He was actually a great hero as well, you know, as someone who maybe was troublesome to work with.
Can I ask you a question, Stephen? Which is, if we exempt your relative,
yes,
who would you like to play in the Titanic story if you were going to?
Who would I like to play? Probably Leonardo DiCaprio. There you go, mythology. I would love to be, what I would love to see seriously, I would love to be down playing someone, not him, but down the Black Gang, the people who made all of that shipping of the era, the steamships work. And I would just like a few minutes to just see what they went through. On the Titanic, it was very electronic. There were these new innovations, technology innovations on the Titanic, but they had the equivalent for the crews stoking the engines. They had the equivalent of that guy with the drums in Ben-Hur, that Roman on the galleys. They had a metronome system, which if they wanted to go faster, it increased, the bells increased, and it gave them the rhythm that they had to keep moving the coal forward and moving in. I mean, that's an appalling thing to do, working men to have to keep to. And they were exhausted. I'd like to see that. I'd like to play one of those because they're the heroes. And they often work naked, or they sometimes work without lots of clothes. And if they, this is a detail I don't think I need to share with you, but if they needed to go to the lavatory, they didn't have any time, so they would often go on their shovel and put it into the boiler. Would you believe? I'll leave you with that wonderful detail of my relative.
And we should remember that's driving the whole industrial.
Yeah, exactly.
That's driving, that's how it works.
Not just on ships, it's everywhere.
Biofuels, ladies and gentlemen.
Shoveling coal and other things into boilers.
Yes.
How are we for time? Do we have time for another question?
We're gone over, but we can squeeze
Should we squeeze in one more?
Last question.
One more question over here, yeah?
Yes.
You, madam, yeah.
Hello. I was just wondering, do you think that the legacy of Titanic is still slightly whitewashed? Because there are, we bring up the stories of the wealthy and the different classes, but we never bring up, for example, the Chinese passengers who were on, or mentioned in the podcast, the fact that there were 4 Syrian weddings during the eventual passage. And I was just wondering if you still think that's the case, because, as mentioned at the Belfast Museum, there is a billboard for the Chinese passengers, but it's outside the main exhibit. So they show everyone else, and then as you leave, you see the passengers.
I was very keen when we started working on the podcast that we try and tell all the stories, well, not all the stories of Titanic, because there are thousands of them, but try to tell some of the less well-known stories, certainly. And we don't really go into the Chinese passengers, though I know there's a book about them that I think is very interesting. But we do talk quite a lot about the Lebanese passengers, because we managed to speak to a descendant of one of those passengers. And actually, that's another guy I would love to have asked a question to, is this guy Jerios Abisab, who had travelled from his village in rural Lebanon. By the time they got onto Titanic, they'd already made this massive, epic journey, basically, this kind of migrant journey. And this was meant to be just like the last week they're down in steerage, but in relative, steerage on Titanic is pretty luxurious compared to steerage on most other ships. And for those passengers, one of the things that strikes me about it, and his descendant talked about this, is, a lot of these people didn't speak English. So as much as we think of the third-class passengers being sort of left behind when the evacuation happens. And that's a whole complicated issue as to why so few steerage passengers ended up in the boats relative to the other groups. But if you think of the kind of chaos of that moment and the communication that's going on, sort of trying to tell people what's happening, and then you think there are all these people on board who don't speak English and don't know what they're being told, just how terrifying must that have been to realise you don't even have someone telling you the ship is going down or you've got to get in a lifeboat. You're kind of, I don't know. I just think that must be a very, I suppose we know about it today. You know, one of the reasons we started thinking about doing this podcast was there was all the interest around the submersible that imploded, the Titan, and at the same time that conversation about the migrant boats. And it just seemed to me, you know, Titanic is both. Titanic is billionaires, well, they were millionaires at the time, but what we would consider billionaires on the upper decks, and it's dirt poor migrants on the lower decks. And it kind of tells both those stories. You know, it's 113 years ago.
Yeah.
But those two combined stories, they're in there. Do you know what I mean? And all of those stories are in there. And that was my goal, at least, was that we try to at least gesture in all those directions as much as we could.
I mean, I agree with that. I would like those kinds of stories to stop being the kind of alt history of the Titanic and start being the history of the Titanic, right? Because I think that's really important. Yeah, it is a ship built for immigrants, mostly. Yeah. That's why it has 4 funnels, 4 smokestacks, right? It only needed 3. The 4th one is a dummy funnel. But immigrants believed that a ship, which had, ironically, believed that a ship that had 4 funnels was safer than a ship that had 3 funnels. So they put an extra one on so that they would make sure to attract a sufficient number of the immigrant trade. The Cameron film actually does a really good job with that. If you watch the detail in the Cameron film, you can see full smoke coming out of 3 of the funnels and just a little bit of smoke because it was the kitchen ventilation.
And that was the very funnel which falls down, as appears in some of them, which knocked my great-uncle out of the ship and towards the lifeboat.
So, yeah. So
some people were killed by it. He was hit. It caused a wave which led him away, that very funnel.
Yeah, it pushes the boat away.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. You mentioned the word whitewash, and I think it's a bit like, you know, a movie like something, I don't know, The Godfather, where you see it a film you might love, and you see it so many times. When you first watch it, you see the first uber narrative of the whole thing. But when you've seen it for the 20th time, you want to know why they say a particular line or the small detail. I think after 113 years or so, I think stories like My Great Uncle's are now being heard. They're in print, you know, and I'm optimistic. I think we move, it's not whitewashing, but evolution. I think we now want to hear all of the other real, you know, parallel stories that get lost in the first watching that now you want to see. That's what I think it is. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we should probably wrap up because I know there are many other panels to go today, many other events. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm just coming up to just say a huge thank you to Stephanie, Stephen and Duncan for such a fascinating session. Thank you very much.